Yeah. So last week we talked about how anti-airs, how you can make your anti-airs a little bit better. We also started getting into this, which I've very much kind of made this like something of a rudder or a central hub, if you will, of how I want to think about tech and growing gameplay forward, and that is that everything sharpens everything. When you get better at one thing, it's going to make the other parts of your game stronger in various ways. And so last week we talked about how to have better anti-airs, and the gist of that was to not lock yourself into as many committed moves, similar to fireballs, but the same thing goes for heavy attacks and things like that. That lock you into in a game where you're measuring by frames. Those extra frames are often the difference between whether or not you're going to be able to knock somebody that jumps in at you out of the air, or have to block them. You don't want to ever have to block either, because that's a loss in and of itself. But this time, I want to talk about how to make your jump ins more effective. And because the rewards for that are astronomical in fighting games, right? Because the most obvious benefit of having a good jump in is the damage you do. It's like tacking on a full extra fierce to your most damaging combo. You're going to get some corner carry. You might get some Oki, and you're lopping off a whole bunch of the opponent's life bar. So that's very obvious, and no wonder people want to do it for that kind of reward. But there's another.
And also in Street Fighter, like jumping has not actually been as efficient as it is in Street Fighter V. Capcom specifically designed jumps to be extremely powerful in this game. Most characters have a very strong jumping combo that they can do, and so the incentive to jump, especially at certain points in the matchup, is much higher than it has ever been in a Street Fighter game. I think this is the highest it's ever been. But
yeah, and the more that the game rewards you for doing so, especially when you have input lag and things like that, making forward dashes and forward jumps a mix up in and of themselves, no wonder people are going to do it, right? What I want to understand here, this is going to be something of like a journey where the pot at the end of the rainbow that's filled with gold, or whatever you would want the pot to be filled with, the reward there is more effective and efficient jump-ins. But this process, and to understand how we get there, is filled with little lessons that, hot damn, you understand those, and it's going to refine so many parts of your gameplay from both your perspective as an offensive and a defensive player. So I want to go through this, but just know at the end of this, the overall lesson is how do we make our jump-ins more effective? But you got to learn a few things on the way to that. First thing I want to establish here is the other reason why people tend to jump, and it's not just for the benefit of the damage. It's something that I've begun calling the half-court shot. When you are approaching someone in Street Fighter specifically, and this applies across the board to most fighting games, but things get tweaked around. We're talking about Street Fighter V here, but when you approach someone, you have to get into their danger zone where they could strike you. That red zone in front of them where, hey, if you're there, there's the potential that one of their normals or one of their farther reaching specials could hit you. And naturally, you don't want to be there. As you understand the game, you understand what it means to get hit, you're instinctually not going to want to be there. And so a lot of people will get right up to the edge of the danger zone, and without thinking about these things, they're not going, well, I'm at the edge of the danger zone, so now what do I want to do? They're instinctually going, well, I could try to navigate and weave through and thread all these needles, or I could jump over it and soar through the clouds and come down like Thor with a hammer and do all this damage and get all this advantage. I think I'm just going to do that. That's a lot better, you know? And so at the lowest level of like resolution of understanding this, you can just see your opponent as a blob, you know, that could do damage and that you need to do damage to, and say, I don't want to be in the red zone. I'm going to jump over it and try to do what I can. Now, obviously, if you're just jumping forward and they're ready to anti-air you, the cost is you're going to lose some life. They're going to gain momentum, and whatever the benefits of their anti-air is, you're going to have to hold those. And what I'm coming down to, or one of the things I noticed as I went through this, is that there aren't a lot of times where you actually want to be jumping forward, right? So it's more of a think about how to earn the forward jumps, the jump ins, and it's most of the time you're not supposed to do it, and so you shouldn't be doing it. That's the first kind of lesson that I.
One of the things I love that you said last week was sticking out like a big normal, and basically like, you know, a big standing heavy kick with Nikali comes to mind, or pretty much anything, and almost like that's a fireball, right? And waiting for that, and obviously, you know, the classic thing is that if you see a fireball, jump over it, right, and hit the other person. That can be a problem in this game especially, but that core tenet of fighting games, that if you see a fireball, jump over and hop over well, it's a very similar thing with those big normals. So to kind of bring this home for people, whenever you see one of those big Urian freaking handshakes, or Nikali doing his double fist thing, or what, a double hand thing, I guess.
We're gonna call it the double fist thing from now on.
Yeah, there you go. Because it definitely doesn't
change
have
it in the Event Hub's moves listings. The Nikali double fist. How much damage does it do?
Maybe it doesn't do damage. Maybe it's pleasurable. Anyway, no, never mind.
It gives certain characters life back.
But anyway, looking for those kind of attacks and not laughing at them when you see them now, but looking for those kind of things and jumping in on them. That's one of the kind of the main ways you can establish not just jumping because it's a good idea, because you think it's going to work, but like looking for that kind of stuff actively. Right.
So that's part of earning the jump in. And as we're going to get to here, yes, it's when you get your opponent to start committing to playing that way, to start throwing fireballs and have their focus somewhere specific. Because another way of thinking about this, let me back up really quick and just say with that half-court shot, it's like getting up to half-court, seeing the rest of the players in front of you and saying, I don't want to mess with that. I'm just going to chuck the ball from half-court. Low probability of making it, though. And so, anyways, but you can think about this.
It's so funny that you actually mentioned that, because that's going on. I love basketball, and players like Trae Young and Damian Lillard and Steph Curry are kind of all doing that right now. Not quite half court, but they're like shooting from the logo, which is almost half court. They're doing exactly what you're talking about, but they're so good at doing it. They're making it efficient, but
it's because the net code in the NBA lets them do that kind of a thing where they have too much reward off of those kind of low resolution, low probability moves, and that's making it not fun for everybody else. Because now we don't get to play the game. We just have Steph get halfway and then throw the ball up and anyways, not unless a player is stunned or they're completely locked into a fireball, and well, I'm going to say unless a player is stunned, your jump in is really not guaranteed, right? Because it's based on your opponent's reaction times. It's kind of like playing blackjack. You're never guaranteed the win, but you can understand when the probability of success is the highest, and then place your high bets at that time by counting cards, which I don't encourage, but that's what you would do. In this, it's like, how do we count our Street Fighter cards and know when your opponent is least likely to be ready to anti-air you? That's the way you should be thinking about it, right? Not jumping instinctually because you're afraid of navigating certain waters, and also not jumping because you're frustrated, although some of us just do that, and I understand it, whatever, you got to get it out. And you're probably aware that this is not what you should be doing when you're doing it, but there you go.
I like how you say some of us, and you need to replace that with all of us. Because it's like, you know what? I'm really pissed off right now. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to freaking jump. And that's like Sako, it's Daigo, it's everyone. It's like, you know what? You're going to rip that DP. You're going to do something because you're losing, and you got to do something, even if it's the worst possible thing you can do. So.
Exactly. So where we start, though, everything that you do sends a message to your opponent, manipulates them, and influences them in some way. The highest level of players are going to be more actively aware of what you're doing and thinking about it, let's say, with the forefront of their mind. But even lower level players are going to be influenced by what you're doing, and if they're not aware of that, you can see that as an advantage to you, because it means that they're probably not going to update their rhythm to counter what you're doing, and you can take advantage of that. That's a benefit for you. And I would say just anybody that's, how would you put it, like kind of used to the water, and if you had to put like a specific like mile marker here, you might say like halfway through silver rank. I think every player there and above has already gotten their instincts down for the Street Fighter atmosphere, and many players that are below that rank too have. But I would just say you can start to play this kind of a game with players like that. And the answer to players that haven't figured it out yet, they're probably just playing a one-player game where they're doing very low probability things, and you just got to identify the dumb things they're doing, like not blocking on wake up or ripping DPs constantly, get on the counter rhythm to that, and just dial it in until the round's over, kind of a thing. But we're talking about players that can be influenced, and that's the majority of them. And so what you do with where Street Fighter V's meta is right now, as we've talked about in recent episodes, as we watch, like the CPT events play out and such, if you're playing footsies, man, and you are sticking out medium buttons. Why? Because we don't want to overcommit, right? We don't want to be fishing with those heavies and those crush counters, because one, they can be crushed, or they can be whiff punished more easily now in Season 5, and also because we don't want to get jumped in on, as we learned last week. So you're using those medium buttons to catch potential forward dashes, or to maybe get some whiff punishes in. But what you're doing when you're doing that is that you are telling your opponent you are a wall, right? They have to their opponent right now is a wall. And what do you do against a wall in Street Fighter? Well, you're probably going to back up. You can throw some fireballs at a wall, right? And you can go up and the natural counter, if I'm seeing someone stick up a bunch of buttons that they are trying to catch my forward advances with, I'm going to go up to them at max range and start pressing the higher priority crush counter buttons, trying to catch those. Now, not getting whiff punished, you gotta space it right, but the counter to that, or a counter to that, I should say, is using those heavier buttons that we talked about and like you were getting at. Like, when you see your opponent start to do that, to make that change, you know that one, they see you as a wall. Do walls jump forward? Not so much. So they're probably not looking at you as someone who's going to jump forward. They're looking at you as someone who's thinking about their forward advances. And now you've got their focus on the horizontal. That's an advantage. And you have to know that, all right, right now the deck is stacked a little bit in my favor. So if you see them tossing out those Urian handshakes, things along those lines, that's a time where you might consider jumping in. And if they're throwing fireballs, like that's the most Street Fighter, the counter to fireballs, the most obvious one is jumping over them. So that's one way you can manipulate, and you'll know they're in that zone because you see them update to deal with what you're doing. And that's really important.
It's really tempting in this game, Street Fighter V, to just play the one-player game. It's beneficial. It works well, but you lack consistency there. If you're a Rashid player who mashes his face on the joystick, which is 98% of Rashid players, you're pretty much going in there. And I mean, Rashid can play a one-player game better than most characters in this, right? And just do stuff and hope it works. And if it doesn't, well, yeah, he's Rashid. He's got an EXDP and a bunch of other stuff where he can just kind of turn the tide of the matchup at a moment's notice, right? But what happens with that when you play that way is you have very inconsistent results.
Yep.
And I'm sitting here cracking up as you're talking about all this stuff and going, why didn't I remember this as I'm running, the sets that I've been playing recently? Why am I not taking John's advice?
All of us. Why am I not taking my own advice when I play? How many times have I been sitting there like, you stupid, dumb idiot, why did you jump there? I'm telling myself this as much as I'm telling you guys, which is why it's worthwhile knowledge, guys. You might go, yeah, duh, this is obvious. Yeah, but it's also not. And like, until you are perfect about anti-airs and jumping in, don't listen a little bit. So, but I'm sorry, you were saying.
Well, I remember Filipino Champ talking about this when I was talking to him about Street Fighter 4, and he was talking about adding new elements to his gameplay stuff. And he was saying, like, look, like, when you're adding new stuff in, it's all the other stuff is gonna go to crap for a little while because you're trying to add new elements in, and this is like the stuff you're talking about is extremely fundamental. And so if you're actively aware of this, all of a sudden you might be much more susceptible to a dash up, right? Because you're like, okay, well, I'm really monitoring my footsies, I'm really doing all this, and the opponent's sitting there like, man, this guy's juggling like 8 things here trying to play neutral. It's Street Fighter 5. What is he doing? Dash up, kill, kind of thing. And what happens is like, that you get used to that over time, and you're like, okay, if I do like a random jab or a random thing here, like that stops the dash in, plus I'm still able to play the neutral that you're talking about. I'm still able to be very intelligent, and so you're going to get blown up for this stuff initially if it's a new thing for you or it's something you're more actively trying to do. That's normal. What you don't want to do is go away from something works and is very efficient for you and your character. You just want to like kind of take your lumps, as I'm doing right now quite a bit with Rose. But yeah.
And the other thing to remember here is that this is not just the only way to play the game. This is how you set up a jump in to be more successful, right? So it's like you're not always going to be just sitting there as a wall. But when you are playing as a wall, that is a time where you can begin to prime your opponent in this particular way for being more susceptible to a jump in. Right? And at the same time, everything that we've gone over so far, like the tendencies of when people want to jump, think about it this way. It's like if you are making the danger zone scary, you're going to make your opponent want to jump forward. That's something good to know, not only as the defender, but also as the aggressor, because they're probably doing the same to you. Are they trying to make the danger zone scary so that you jump forward? That's not a good time for you to jump. Right? And like I said before, there are not a ton of times where you should be jumping forward. You need to be doing it when they're committed and to the ground game and when their focus is in this particular area. There are a few other things, though, that as I've been doing some research, I was watching a Daigo video, for instance, where he has a little bit of a tip in terms of being ready for people dashing forward or jumping forward. And that is, at least with stick players, that you can, especially those who have been playing for a long time, they can see there's a little, like if you're going to forward dash, you double tap the stick, right? Your character moves from that double tap. And a lot of times people will duck before they jump. They'll have little tiny little movements that tip you off. And again, that's huge. If you can predict when someone's going to jump, or if they have a tell, watch out. You're going to anti-air them all the time. So some of the things you can do though is hide those initial movements in like buffered moves. So like do a light kick and then jump, and have that light kick cover any movement that your character might make before jumping or dashing forward. Now you can't be obvious with this because then the light kick becomes your tell, but mixing it in things like that to not give your opponent any cues that you're about to move in on them is really important to keep in mind. Another thing,
I love playing Velociraptor here because whenever he gets super, he starts going like this.
Yeah.
Because he's constantly buffering super. Like, and it's like, and he can't help himself like half the time. And Dream King and I have talked to him about it a lot. Like, dude, like look at a few other options, and he's gotten better about it now. But like a year ago or something like that, it was just like John would get super and he just like doing this constantly, and it's like, dude, ease up a bit, man. Like,
but how many like just normals that you stuck out there got supered because I was ready for it?
For about 6 months, you got us. And then like finally after 6 months, we realized that you weren't going to make an adjustment, that you were going to do it every single time. And we're like, okay, let's just stick out a jab, and like he's going to super it and I'm going to block and I'm going to kill him. And so finally like it came around and stuff again, even though Necalli's super is insane. It's
really good.
But you were also playing characters like Seth and Ryu and other things like that. So their supers are a little slower, so easier to block and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it goes hand in hand with what you're saying with the tell though. If you can see the person gyrating on the controller basically, or gyrating maybe with their character gyrating. My
their
goodness,
character's ducking a lot.
Yeah. But anyway, if you can see that, it's a very obvious tell of probably what they're buffering, right? Mm-hmm. And looking for that, it's hard to do it in the heat of the moment, and it's so important to stay calm. But picking up on that, especially in key scenarios where something is super efficient, the way to pick up on it is when something is super efficient, right? When you have super, you're going to do massive damage. If it lands, that's a very efficient play to spend it at that point in time, especially if it's going to kill. So looking for those, not all throughout a match because there's so many juggling pins to handle, it's looking for it at those key moments in a match where it's like, okay, they've got super, let me really see if they're sitting there buffering it, right? And then try to bait it out.
Well, and then what I would say to that, and that I still do that, and I don't know that I have made much of a correction in terms of whether or not I'm going to be buffering it, because it's a very low cost for me and low risk to be buffering super. You know, it's part of my movement, if anything. But when you know that I'm buffering super, I'm fine with that. I want you to know that, because it also means that you're probably not throwing out fireballs right now, and that takes an entire option for you off the table. And if you do throw the fireball, hey, I'm buffered. All I have to do is hit one button, and that happens a lot. Or people will just throw out a heavy button. I'm like, well, okay. And sometimes I'll catch medium buttons with it. So it's been very beneficial to me because, like we said at the beginning of this, everything you do affects players, and that's me pulling on that bull ring in a certain way, trying to manipulate you. That doesn't mean you have to bend to it, but like you do have to respect it. And so that's a manipulation tactic, as well as a crazy Necalli tactic. But the other thing I wanted to get to is that so many times I know that I have missed anti-airs, not because I didn't see it, and not because I didn't mentally react fast enough. I mean, maybe, but because I physically wasn't able to react fast enough, because where my position on the control on the joystick was far away from where my character's anti-air command was. So like if my character has a forward motion DP and I'm walking backwards, I am not as ready and not as quick to DP as if I'm walking forwards, all things the same. And this was in Street Fighter 4. The opposite was true because my anti-air with Gouken was a backwards motion Tatsu. So if I was walking forward, there were times where I knew I would have gotten the DP had I been walking backwards, but I was walking forwards, and just that travel time, which is not much, but we know that frames are important here, it was enough to make me not get the anti-air. Now, you can sharpen that a lot, and you should, but the fact of the matter is, there's a difference, and you should know what your opponent's anti-airs are. Now, if it's Birdie's crouching medium punch and all he has to do is, or like Falk's single input, Ed's single input, that's its own thing. Those characters are really good at anti-airs, and it's going to be harder. But if you know a character's anti-air is a certain motion or something like that, or their stick needs to be at a certain place, and they're not there because they're moving in a certain direction or doing something, your odds are higher. The deck is stacked a little bit more in your favor. Being aware of these little types of things are crucial, and you know it. You know how much the little frames count. So those are a few things to pay attention to. Small things like covering your movements and not tipping your opponents off earlier than you need to. Being aware of where they need to be on the control stick in order to do the move. And I don't know if it translates to pad players as much. Maybe it's easier for them. It is what it is. But those are some little tips, and then the bigger thing is just understanding that whole kind of psychological push and pull that goes on, where you're sending information and data constantly back and forth and manipulating each other, observing the rhythm and how much of an influence you're making. And man, I gotta say, there are few things as satisfying as setting up a game plan, manipulating your opponent in real time, and then having that game plan work out, especially with something as awesome as a jump in. It's like when you earn a jump in, that is one of the sexiest things in fighting games or in Street Fighter. It's like, so this is well worth it. And imagine how many more rounds, how many more matches are you going to win for not only getting successful jump ins, but the bigger benefit here is probably not jumping when you shouldn't be jumping, because there's not a ton of opportunity to jump forward, especially the higher up you get. But if you're throwing away opportunities and you're hanging yourself because you're jumping when you shouldn't be, that's probably the bigger takeaway here. But, what's sexier is getting that damage and such. So there you have it. The idea of how to make your jump-ins more efficient. Try this stuff out. Maybe do it in casuals. If you're, especially like we said earlier, if you're not, if you want to practice this kind of a thing, maybe you're going to do a little more of like, I just want to make myself a wall. And that's not always the beneficial thing to do. But if you want to just practice doing that, go into casual and do that. So you're not risking your sweet, sweet LP that's more important than anything else in the game. I understand. But try it out. See if you don't get a little better. See if you don't improve your win rate, and let us know, guys. Send us some feedback on that. If this kind of stuff is helping you out, if you're seeing any, if you have any tips that go along with this, we'd love to hear it. Comments, send us PMs, Twitter, anything.
Yeah, actually, two things that blow me up, in particular with jump-ins, are when I'm looking to activate my V-trigger, because almost everyone in the game, looks to get a normal out there and activate, and it's good to try to kind of sniff that out and then jump in at the opponent at that point in time, because, again, getting a V-trigger out is a highly efficient move, and so basically you're kind of baiting the opponent to try to get their V-trigger out and then jumping on them.
That's good.
The other thing is when I'm in a corner and they've done their block string or whatever, and they've gotten their pressure, and I've dealt with it, and now it's my turn, right? And so I immediately want to hit a normal or do something to get in on them, and that's oftentimes when a jump is coming from a high-level player, because they're like, look, it's your turn to, it's your opportunity to get me, get yourself out of the corner, right? And you're going to do that by any means possible. Now is a great time for a jump, because you're more than likely going to be hitting something here or trying to assert your authority that you've been granted by Street Fighter. Ha ha ha, maybe not. Right. So those are like two quick examples that you might, be able to work on. In particular, like you monitor for those moments in a game and kind of like jump at that time. Jumping is good in this. It might sound scrubby to like want to jump and stuff like that if you're an old school Street Fighter player, but with this new school game, jumping is very, very good. And what John said here, knowing when to do it, it's huge. So there it is.
And you can refine this for yourself and explore more opportunities. The broad idea here is that anytime that you're distracted and you're not thinking about the skies, that's figure out why and figure out how to do that to your opponent. So that's the kind of the sauce, the way to go about doing it. If you want to figure out how to be even more efficient, effective, then that's the way to go about it.